Welcome to the deep dive. There's this belief you hear everywhere, right? That children are like these amazing sponges for language.
They just soak it up.
Exactly. But then for adults, it's like, well, you're kind of doomed to struggle. You'll always have that accent. It's pretty common thinking.
It really is. And honestly, it can be quite discouraging if you're, trying to learn later in life.
Totally. So today we're going to really unpack that whole idea about learning a second language, or L2. We've done a deep dive into some really fascinating research.
Yeah, and it throws up some surprising truths, actually, about what really helps people succeed.
Our mission here is basically to debunk some of those myths and give you some, well, actionable insights, whether you're learning a language yourself or maybe you're just curious about how we learn stuff.
That's the plan. We looked at some foundational studies research focusing on age, yes, but also motivation, and the nitty-gritty of how we actually make L2 sounds. It gives you a much more holistic picture.
Okay, so let's dig into that first big one. This popular idea that kids just sort of pick up languages like effortlessly. How true is that, really?
Well, it's mostly a misconception. The surprising thing is research often shows that older learners, we're talking adolescents, adults, they're frequently faster.
Faster, really?
Not faster. And more efficient, especially in the early stages of learning a second language.
Yeah.
They often make quicker progress, especially if they're in a classroom setting.
Wow, okay. That completely goes against the grain, so the whole magical absorption thing from day one.
It's not quite like that.
Mm,
Think about French immersion in Canada. Studies looked at kids starting really early, like kindergarten, versus kids starting later, maybe grade 7 or 8.
right.
And the late starters often did just as well, sometimes even better on certain measures. It really suggests older students can be very effective learners.
Okay, so that throws a wrench into the whole critical period thing too, doesn't it? That idea
Yeah.
that there's this biological cutoff, maybe puberty, after which language learning gets way harder.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That idea often comes from one really influential study.
Yeah.
But interestingly, when other researchers recrunched the numbers from that same study,
What did they find?
they found that, yeah, there was some drop-off in proficiency, but it didn't really start until after age 20, not puberty, not 15.
After 20.
And crucially, it was mostly for grammatical bits that were very different from the learner's first language. So that biological clock, if there is one, it seems to tick a lot slower and maybe differently than we assumed. It's not this absolute hard stop.
Right. And then there's the brain science angle. People always bring that up. Surely our brains change as we get older, and that's the real barrier, isn't it? That must be why adults struggle.
Well, neuroscience has found differences. Studies using brain scans show that early and late bilinguals might use slightly different parts of the brain or organize languages differently, like maybe distinct spots in Broca's area for L1 and L2 in later learners.
Uh-huh. So there is a difference.
There is. But here's the kicker. Those studies, they didn't actually report data on how proficient the people were in the second language.
Oh.
Yeah.
No.
So there's no strong evidence that directly links those different brain activation patterns to worse learning or lower overall proficiency. We see a difference, but we can't say it causes a problem for learning.
That's fascinating. So just because the brain activity looks different, it doesn't automatically mean it's less effective or that adults are somehow handicapped.
Exactly. Other research hasn't found any link between proficiency and those different brain patterns in older learners.
Yeah.
And that whole idea about myelination, the brain coding that supposedly makes our brains less flexible, there's no clear proof it actually stops us learning languages.
So the key study is missing then.
Pretty much. The study that would compare brain activity in kids and adults who've reached the same high level of proficiency, well, it just hasn't really been done. So the neurobiological case for a strict age limit, it's just not that solid.
Okay, so if the age thing isn't a hard barrier and the brain science isn't conclusive, why do so many adults seem to struggle? What's going on for people trying to learn later?
Yeah, that's a fair question. And it brings us to something called the fallacy of misemphasis. We tend to focus on the struggles.
Right. We hear the stories about people trying for years and not getting there.
Exactly. But while many adults do face challenges, the research actually shows huge variation. It's not like all adults fail equally. Some adults absolutely do achieve native-like proficiency. We just don't talk about them as much.
And you mentioned earlier that how we test proficiency might mess with the results too.
Oh, definitely. The testing methods can really skew things, like studies where older learners just talk spontaneously. They often showed better pronunciation than studies where they had to, say, read text aloud or imitate sentences.
Why would that be?
Well, think about reading aloud in English or French. the spelling to sound rules could be really complex, right? That adds a whole other layer of difficulty that might not reflect their actual speaking ability.
Good point.
And even the format written text versus oral tests. Some studies found fewer age-related issues when the tests were written. It suggests some of what looks like a language decline might just be, general age-related changes in how quickly we process sounds or maybe attention, not a fundamental block on learning the language itself.
Okay, this is shifting things quite a bit. So if age isn't the main culprit, what really makes the difference? What are the actual drivers for succeeding in a second language? It feels like we've been blaming the wrong thing.
I think that's fair to say. And one of the biggest factors that comes up again and again in the research is motivation and how you see yourself.
Motivation, okay.
Yeah, there was this really big study looking at Hungarian students, secondary school, university, adults learning languages. They found a couple of key things were really powerful motivators.
Like what?
One was what they called the ideal L2 self. Basically, your vision of yourself as a competent, successful speaker of the language.
Ah, so really picturing yourself doing it well.
Yeah, exactly. And the other was international posture, which is kind of like having a cosmopolitan outlook, being interested in foreign affairs and connecting with other cultures. Those two things were consistently high motivators across all the age groups.
That's interesting. So it's less about just needing it for a job or, the old idea of wanting to integrate with native speakers.
Precisely. That traditional idea of integrativeness seemed less relevant now, especially with English being such a global language. It's not always about identifying with Brits or Americans, for example. And other reasons, like feeling you ought to learn it or for practical benefits, turned out to be, more complex than we thought. They sometimes broke down into different things, like wanting knowledge versus wanting to travel.
Did that motivation change much with age in the study?
It did shift a bit. University students tended to have the strongest ideal L2 self
Yeah.
and international posture. They also showed more motivated behavior, like actually putting the effort compared to the younger secondary school students. And what motivated them differed too. For the teenagers, being interested in, say, English language music or movies, cultural interest, was a big driver, whereas that international posture was more strongly linked to motivation in the older groups.
So younger learners might be more influenced by the classroom, the teacher?
Yeah, the study suggested that.
Yeah.
While older learners seemed more driven by their own clear personal goals for learning the language.
And I remember reading something about gender playing a role too, which kind of ties into that self-perception idea that was quite revealing.
It does seem to. Another study, this one with English secondary school kids learning French and German, found that girls generally showed higher motivation for language learning across the board. They liked it more, wanted to learn more, put in more effort.
And the boys?
Well, boys often saw French as feminine. They literally said things like language of love and stuff. They felt it wasn't cool to try hard and didn't like tasks they saw as boring. But German, on the other hand, they perceived as more masculine, logical, maybe useful for industry. Some even associate it with war, Hitler, and all that. So it appealed more to them. It really shows how these cultural stereotypes can get tangled up with motivation.
That's quite stark. Did that study find anything else about their learning habits?
Yes, something quite striking, actually. Across all the students, even the ones doing really well, they reported using very few metacognitive strategies.
Metacognitive? What's that exactly?
It's things like planning your learning, thinking about how you learn best, checking your own understanding, evaluating your progress, sort of thinking about your thinking.
Okay.
And even the high achievers weren't really doing much of that. It suggests there might be a big gap in teaching kids how to learn effectively, not just what to learn.
Right. Okay, let's zoom in a bit on pronunciation, because that's often seen as the ultimate test, isn't it? Sounding native. If it's not just age, what makes some people get the accent down better than others?
Yeah, pronunciation is a big one. A really helpful model here is Fleege's speech learning model, or SLM. It focuses on how good your pronunciation can ultimately get. And crucially, it assumes our sound systems, our phonetic systems, can keep adapting throughout life.
Okay, so not fixed after childhood.
Exactly. And a key idea is that to produce sounds accurately, you first need accurate perceptual targets in your brain. You need to be able to hear the distinctions properly.
So if my brain hears, say, an English sound, but just maps it onto the closest sound I already have, like an S or a T.
Then you'll likely produce that S or T instead. Exactly. If your first language, L1 phonology, kind of filters out the important little details, the second language, L2 sound, or if you just lump the L2 sound in with an existing L1 category, your production won't be spot on.
And does age play a role here in perception?
According to the model, yes. The likelihood of noticing those subtle sound differences between languages tends to decrease as your age of learning goes up.
Mm.
So maybe a 10-year-old German learner is more likely to really hear the difference between the English A and cat and their German E sound than an adult learner might be.
Interesting.
The model also suggests something cool. Learning a second language can actually change how you pronounce your first language slightly.
Really?
Yeah. Bilinguals might start producing, say, the P or T sounds in their native language with a little puff of air, more like in English. If English is their L2, their L1 and L2 sound systems can kind of influence each other.
Can you give an example of a specific pronunciation challenge this explains?
Sure. Think about the sound again.
Hmm.
Japanese learners often substitute it with S, while Russian learners might use T. Why the difference? It's because S is the closest sound in the Japanese system, and S is the closest in the Russian system. Your L1 dictates your default substitution. Or consider learners whose native language doesn't have that puff of air aspiration after sounds like PT. Think French, Italian, Spanish speakers learning English. They often produce English, PT, without enough aspiration, making them sound a bit different. The model suggests their existing L1 sound category makes it harder to create a totally new one for the aspirated English sound.
But does this mean they literally can't hear the difference? Is it an auditory problem?
Not necessarily. It's more about how the brain categorizes the sounds based on linguistic experience. There was a classic study with Japanese listeners who struggled to tell rock and lock apart.
Right, the R and L distinction.
Exactly. But even though they couldn't reliably distinguish the whole syllables, they could distinguish specific acoustic cues within those sounds when they were isolated. So their ears could pick up the physical difference, but their language-tuned brain wasn't treating it as a meaningful phonemic distinction.
Okay, so it's perception and production. What else influences success beyond motivation and phonetics?
Well, the learning environment itself and the actual strategies you use are hugely important. It's not all internal.
How so?
Studies have shown adults can really improve their pronunciation with targeted training on sounds, or even, interestingly, just by having a silent period at the start where they just listen intensively, kind of like how babies learn.
Mimicking early learning conditions.
Exactly. It shows that dedicated exposure and practice work. And there's this dynamic between your first and second language. Sometimes even very young kids learning in L2 don't achieve perfect native-like pronunciation, and it can even affect their L1 a bit.
Oh, right.
Older learners, on the other hand, are usually better at maintaining their L1 proficiency. Sometimes that might even come at the expense of fully developing the L2, especially if they live in an environment where they use their L1 a lot.
So using your native language frequently might reinforce its patterns and make it harder to adopt new L2 patterns?
That's the idea. One prominent researcher, Fleege, basically argues that the general trend of pronunciation getting less native-like with age is less about biology shutting down and more about how strong your L1 habits are and how much you use your L1.
Mm.
It's an interaction, not a biological destiny.
So again, it sounds like there's much more within the learner's control than we usually think.
Absolutely. Things like your general aptitude for learning, your beliefs about your own ability, your confidence, even just your willingness to try speaking. Research shows these correlate much more strongly with success than age itself, and those are things you can influence. So pulling it all together from this deep dive, age does play a role in language learning, yes, but it seems to be more of a correlate. It goes along with other changes, social factors, psychological ones, educational background, rather than being this strict biological cutoff point that limits what adults can achieve.
It's not a hard barrier, but a factor among many.
Precisely. It's a correlate, not a constraint, you could say.
And that has some pretty big practical implications, doesn't it? For teaching, for policy, for anyone learning a language.
Huge implications. For example, the idea that we must start foreign languages in very early grades purely for biological reasons. The research doesn't really back that up strongly. Young children actually learn quite slowly in classrooms. They cover less ground than older students.
Right.
For early language teaching to really pay off long term, it needs to be really well designed, consistent, and crucially properly built upon in later grades. Just having a bit of language